panel here. Let me introduce the members of the panel. Professor Gabor Halmai, Professor Emeritus at ELTE, Social Science School, and also he spent the last 10 years or 12 years at Princeton University at the EUI, European University Institute in Florence. Then I am going to go this way. Kristof Szombati. He used to be very active in Hungarian politics. He lives now in Berlin, and he is a fellow at the foundation, Kettering Foundation there, and also editor of the Review of Democracy, and he is an anthropologist, CEU graduate, if I am not mistaken. And then Christina Griessler, docent at the Andrassy University, that is associate professor, right? Yeah, at the Andrassy University in Budapest, and political scientist. And Boldizsar Nagy, whom I know for a long time as well, Professor Emeritus from CEU, but also he has been teaching at Eötvös University Law School. So he is an international law scholar, and Gabor Halmai is a constitutional law scholar, legal scholar. So as we agreed, we start with a sort of foundational question in which these people will define themselves, because they are coming from different profession, different circle, and the idea is that we need to discuss issues from different angles and not so much focusing on the expertise only, but to reflect to each other and to have a lively intellectual conversation. So Gabor, as a constitutional lawyer, now Europe's identity is, yes, please keep the next mic, is questioned recently, and what do you think, what is the current state of constitutionalism in Europe? Does Europe need a constitution? There was an attempt right after the millennium which did not really work out, but then there was some modifications of the Roma founding document after the Lisbon Treaty. And what is the constitutional identity, if there is any, in Europe? And just because my youth hero Jürgen Habermas just died a few days ago, let me mention his name, and he was also talking about constitutional patriotism as a possible source of identity for West European countries. I know that this question will require 1.5 hours from you to respond, but maybe you have some ideas as an introduction to elaborate your points.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. Let me also start with Habermas's concept of the constitutional patriotism and the idea of Europe. I just read today in maybe it was in the Guardian, saying that Habermas was the last European. Also in the sense that he imagined Europe as a kind of Völkerstaat or Völkerbund, certainly coming from Kant's idea of perpetual peace, who also imagined a kind of federation, not only a federation, and first and foremost not a federation of economic powers, but federations of ideas and values. You mentioned the European Constitution as an idea. Actually, Habermas had a very interesting discussion with the German constitutional scholar, a former constitutional court judge, Dieter Grimm, whether Europe needs a constitution or not. Grimm's point was that since there is no such thing as European nation, there is no such thing as European public discourse, there are no European parties, there is no space for a European constitution. Habermas actually agreeing with those lack of preconditions argued for a constitution and argued for a constitutional patriotism, both in the member states and Europe-wide for the European Union. His main point in that respect was that a European constitution will be somehow accelerate the procedure to becoming a joint European people with constitutional values and constitutional patriotism. As we all know, from actually the 2010s onwards, Europe as a value system which should be and must be the basis of any constitution is very much declining. Thanks to my own government, the Orbán government from 2010 onwards, followed by some other would-be and real autocrats in that respect. So today, I guess there are two alternatives theoretically. One alternative would be a stronger confederation, as, for instance, elaborated by my former EOI colleague Calypso Nicolaidis. The other idea is a federalist idea, for instance, represented by many. Let me mention another colleague of mine who is from Lewis University. He is Luigi. The name's coming. It's very Fabrini. Fabrini also dreams of a federalist system. And let me very quickly react to this, that I'm afraid that none of those ideas can be anyhow work without member states being committed to these values, joint values, or joint constitutional identity of the EU. And therefore, none of those approaches are really feasible in a short run, maybe longer. And let me finish by saying what Hans Kundnami wrote in the Jacobin magazine on Habermas, that actually it seems to be that all his ideas about Europe and the European constitutional sphere seems to be very illusionary today, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And of course, the subtitle of the event is Hungarian Authoritarian Elections in Comparative Perspective, and we are bringing Europe here because that is also a topic of the election. Europe versus Moscow, Russia versus Brussels, life versus death, peace versus war. So these are these polarized questions which are mentioned, and Europe is part of the discussion in Hungary as well. I don't think that Hungary is the most important story here, because Europe has their own problems as well, and that might give an opportunity for authoritarian or autocratizing states to behave in a sort of non-value based manner, extracting the funds from the EU while not sharing the values. So I think when we talk about autocratization and authoritarian elections, we have to refer to the European values. What are these values, and how can we compare this to those countries which do not keep these values, do not take it seriously? The next question will go to Kristof Szombati, an anthropologist, and someone who studied ordinary people and experiences from below their ordinary life in Hungary, the Roma community, and also in East Germany. What does Europe mean for you on the ground in this special moment? We did not speak yet about this, that this is a wartime moment, and Europe was not designed for war or war environment, but it was designed for peace and prosperity. So what does that mean, and what does reveal about the political dangers ahead? The floor is yours.
Thanks. So yeah, I come at this from a very different angle. I studied basically the social dislocations of post-socialist transformation in rural Hungary, so villages, small towns, trying to understand why the far right was coming to power. When I started my research, it was clear that the wave was already growing, but it hadn't come to power, and it clearly had to do something with these, what I called social dislocations of economic transformation. I've been living in Germany for 3 years and studying, well, football hooligans in East Germany, but more closely trying to understand the links between, again, the East German experience of post-socialist transformation and the local politics as they are currently. As we all know, the AfD is gaining heavily ground. And I guess we'll come to Hungary, but I just wanted to give an idea of where I come to with this. How do the people I encounter in the field think about Europe? And I guess the first thing to say is that they don't look at Europe as a series of treaties or abstract values. For them, it is something experienced through the everyday. When that means jobs, mobility, whether their kids will have a decent schooling, the state of public services, whether one's world is going to be protected or dissolved. These are the questions that kind of are on people's mind in their everyday, and they engage in politics through these questions, through this way of looking at it. Now, if we look across Europe, I mean, what we see currently, just think of the French elections yesterday, the elections in Rhineland-Pfalz, you see a lot of deindustrializing places, or even places that are not yet deindustrializing, but the fears of deindustrialization are already there, impacting on people's psyche and consciousness. And what people, I felt, again, having studied East Germany and Hungary, feel is a deficit of solidarity. That's what I would call it. So they feel abandoned, a lot of them, by both national and European elites. They feel their insecurity, they feel downward mobility, and that these concerns are not taken seriously enough, or worse, that some of these elites are actually working against them. At the same time, if you think back, working class communities, poorer people's communities are asked to take up support, or to support causes that are way beyond themselves, so to say. First it was the new members in Eastern Europe that needed to be supported by Western Europeans. Then it was the refugee reception, remember 2015, 2016. Since 2022, it's Ukraine. And many think or see these causes as not necessarily illegitimate, so many of them are still legitimate for them, but they don't feel themselves protected, or not protected enough. I think this partly has to do, and if we want, we can discuss this later, about the institutional architecture of European integration, namely that certain expansive regional repair programs are simply not possible within the limits of the Maastricht criteria, like the whole neoliberalism debate, if you will. And there are also simply certain policies like housing that have been outside the orbit of the EU. And everyone in the EU now discusses this, but the EU doesn't have the prerogative to actually intervene in a market that is in crisis heavily, and that is pushing young people these days to vote for the far right in many places like the Netherlands. So what I'm trying to say is that these dislocations, this fear, this insecurity that is pretty widespread now, but especially widespread among working people, is creating an opening for the far right. What the far right is doing, I'll have to be brief here, is it converts this failure of downward solidarity into an argument against external solidarity, against solidarity for Ukrainians, for migrants, for refugees. I can say more about that, but I don't want to deliberately. I don't want to take too much time. And so how does the far right enter it? Well, it says, it's not asking people why the politics is failing you. It's not trying to come up with arguments about how to solve these dislocations. It is concentrating on why the money is going somewhere else. And not just the money, but why the recognition, why the attention is going somewhere else. And it has been extremely good at diverting this, so at translating these fears into that kind of stigmatization of threatening outsiders or just people who are less worthy than the hardworking majorities. Last comment. So besides externalizing these fears and finding scapegoats, the far right is also quite successful in scaling this up, I think, into a broader vision of Europe. So, earlier we thought the far right wanted to destroy Europe. Now we know they don't. They want to change it. And that's probably more dangerous because their vision is of a fortress Europe, which is completely different to what, the people you mentioned had in mind or that generation had in mind. It's not about shared democratic protections. It's about racialized exclusionary differences and policing borders inside and outside Europe. Now, if we come to later to geopolitical questions, what could be worse than an internally polarized Europe that is looking at looking at who to exclude and how to police Muslim communities and others? I mean, we're headed that way, aren't we? So I guess this is my point coming to my end, that the main threat I see, it's not the one we are talking about now because we are absorbed with Iran and all the, the wars that are clearly important around us. But the far right is clearly, quietly, steadily gaining ground and building energies from, I guess, the failures of several decades of European integration. I don't see European integration as a full failure, don't get me wrong, but I think the EU has become an engine for inequality rather than equality, and this is what the far right is taking advantage of.
Thank you very much, and it reminds me to Rogers Brubaker's article, which was written 10 years ago, about two types of populism, the nationalist, ethnicist, Eastern populism, and the other one, what he calls civilizationist populism, how to defend the Christian values in a secular age, which is a new moral panic now in the West vis-a-vis those migrants and refugees and others who you mentioned. But let me move now to Christina Griessler, and we are now touching up on the values and value-based policies, and she initiated to talk a bit about the normative side of the European Union. Is the European Union a normative actor, as a soft power, a normative power? Is it gone, or still it functions like that? Is the EU becoming a purely pragmatic actor in the current geopolitical context? Maybe Hungary contributes to this, pushing it to that direction, being more pragmatic and less normative as it was before. But maybe it is just not the zeitgeist to stay normative anymore. I don't know. This is a question. Please.
Okay, thanks very much. Yes, I normally work on EU enlargement, so I always look at what other countries do outside of the EU and how the EU policies work onto the countries of, in that case, the Western Balkans, so the countries who are aiming to become EU members. And we know there's a lot of difficulties, and I agree with the speak before. The EU has, they have committed mistakes in that regard. So failures have been committed, and that kind of has a back impact on the credibility of the EU, and it's a huge issue. The normative power is more or less the idea that we have norms, and the EU is based on those norms, and I still think this is important. It's important because it's the clue of our European Union. Maybe have a bit of an idealistic approach to it, but I think that it still has an importance, and I do see that it's getting attacked from several sides, and I think we will discuss that later on. So in a way, we will have to defend those norms, but I think this is what makes our European identity as well. So, taking that as a first point, that the EU is the base of the EU are the norms and values, and the effect on the international policies is that it is acting as an international actor, because this normative base is actually attractive for other countries. So you could say, okay, there's too much happening now with wars and conflicts in the region, and the EU is actually not prepared to react to it. Yeah, but we had that in the 1990s already with the Yugoslav wars. And still, it seems like that the EU was not prepared for what's happening in Ukraine. So we can even say, is the EU even an actor to react to conflict, or is the objective something different? But nowadays, I think we have to prepare ourselves to protect for what we think is important, and I think the values are important. Again, as well, we see it maybe from inside, from within the European Union. We think it's actually a deficit or a weakness of how decisions are taken, and that we have to find compromises in a lot of things. In a lot of political decisions, but it's actually a strength, I think, because it's based on a larger legitimacy from the population and from the states. So there is more backing behind it. So now when I see Hungary blocking the budget, the funds for Ukraine, I know, it's possibly to stop that and to end those kind of funding, but it's undemocratic in the sense that the majority of the state's people and the prime ministers have decided on going and pay for Ukraine and support Ukraine. So now Hungary is kind of blocking that, although they don't even have to pay for it. So, normally if you have a meeting and you don't want to agree, you just go for coffee or you go to the toilet and let others decide. But that didn't happen. So it's a deliberate act of blocking and creating problems for the European Union, who have the idea that the invasion of Russia is a mistake and has to be ratified, and support is required. So we have this normative power, so that means how the EU with their norm base and ideas is kind of affecting international politics as well. We have this concept of civil power, civilization of international relations, and we can see if this still is happening. But just one example before I close is I was looking at and you remember maybe Macron had this idea of this European political community. And I wasn't really interested to look into that, because I thought it's a French idea, and French always do like this diplomacy stance. But okay, then I looked into it, and it's actually happening. So every half a year, countries come together, the broader European countries. Even countries of the continent of Europe are coming together, except Belarus and Russia, of course, to discuss political issues in a very informal way. So we know there are no declarations, and we kind of always measure the effectiveness of those kind of political stands on the declarations. But even a declaration doesn't mean that anything is going to happen. But it's this creating a space for contact and creating a space for communication and exchange, which is kind of important. It might not have immediately results, but I think, so the interviews I've done from candidate countries from the Western Balkans were telling me, no, actually, it's interesting, it's good, and we keep going with it. And, you know, we got UK back in those kind of networks. We try to get Turkey in that conversation again. So, I mean, it's very difficult to say in what kind of direction it goes, but it shows still that the EU has, you know, is attractive and has a normative power because they're going to get those countries together to have conversations. The only issue was that originally it was meant to be a gathering of democratic states, and they have changed it now more pragmatically, as we had before, even to more illiberal states, so included them as well. So we will see how that goes, but I think, I hope that the normative idea sustains and will survive. That's my hope.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to motivate all of you to think about these norms. Are they good or bad? So you don't have to just describe, you can also evaluate. You can have your own preference or opinion, which are those norms which survived and which should be reformed maybe, just because those are European norms, not necessarily all of them are perfect. So let's be critical to the European norms as well in order to motivate them to be more innovative and creative on that front. But let me now finally ask Boldizsar Nagy, Professor Nagy, who is an international lawyer and expert on migration and borders and wars. And now he was he was a participant on heated debates in different press outlets on the international law. It seems like international law is just a shadow of the past. It doesn't exist anymore. And do we need a redefinition of international law? Does it mean anything today? Referring to the actions of the American president, Donald Trump, from Venezuela to Iran, people question the validity of international law, although I think that is good for the weaker states and some sort of point of reference, at least. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Let me start with a methodological remark. I prefer talking about the European Union and not of Europe, because for me, Russia is part of Europe, Transnistria is part of Europe, even Turkey is part of Europe. So when we speak about the European norms, let's make it clear that we are talking about the norms of the at the moment 27 states. Or are we talking about the Council of Europe membership, which is 47 or so? So let's be careful with that. But that aside, coming to the topic of international law, which indeed is heavily debated very frequently. First of all, Trump is not standard setting in terms of what international is good for or isn't, okay? So forget Trump. Then you can look at the international law and decide whether you want to talk about it being breached, or do you want to speak about the critique of international law? And these are two different strands. In terms of the breaches, I give you a number of years: 1953, 1956, 1968, 1970s, 1999, 2001, 2003, and 2025-26. All of these witness egregious violations of international law, starting with the Russians coming into Hungary, the Warsaw Pact, including this country marching into Czechoslovakia, the Vietnam War, Afghanistan, Iraq, Kosovo, not to speak about the regional breaches, let's say, Congo's deeds or Rwanda's deeds, and I could list endlessly. China attacking Vietnam, etc. So the question, has the prohibition of the use of force been breached? Yes, all the time. Nothing new there. We here in Central Europe, of course, were shocked by the war in Yugoslavia. It came too close. It was not in Africa. It was not Bangladesh and Pakistan or whoever fighting. But the nature of the fight was no different in Yemen or in Rwanda than the fight in Yugoslavia. So in that term, the breach of the high-flying norms of international law is neither new, nor does it annihilate law as such. Okay? In terms of the critique of the law, What's your expectation? What should international law do in a world in which the Charter of the United Nations incorporates the rules on the Security Council, which incorporate the rule that the 5 permanent members may veto any decision which would entail sanctions or military action in case of a threat or breach of peace. They can block anything being happening, okay? That was designed in 1945, not by chance. So don't expect the UN march against the 5 permanent members or any of their allies, because of course they have the power to veto any action against their allies. Now, who is not an ally of Russia, China, France, Britain, and the US? It was pure Iraq in 2003. Okay, that was perhaps the only one, almost on Haiti occasionally, all right? So if you criticize international law, you have to realize that international law is what the states make of it. International law is strictly based on the consent of the states. If they want to approve slavery, slavery is legal. If they ban slavery, 19th century, then slavery becomes illegal. It's not natural law. It's not God-given law. It's not law derived from reason. It's a construct of the states who undertake to abide by it, provided they express consent to be bound. If you're not a party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, you can develop your nuclear weapons. Non-Proliferation Treaty only binds those who express consent to be bound by it. Then you might try to argue customer law, but that's a complex issue. You need consistent, long-standing state practice and the conviction that that practice is law. If that's not there, there's no rule. I mean, no nuclear weapon was used since 1945. Can you claim that there is a rule prohibiting the use of nuclear weapons? No. Consistent state practice in itself is not enough. There ought to be a conviction, which obviously is not there. So redefine, I don't think so. I mean, the international law does not control the events, but it can be used as a standard, an ideal type in a Weberian sense. This is what state ought to do. Do they do that? No. How much did they deviate? And don't forget, neither in Ukraine nor in Iran will there be a peace without the assistance of international law. There will be a truce, written or verbal. There will be a peace treaty, hopefully soon, written endless pages. Okay? International law never promised that it would bound the states and prevent them from acting. International law is an argument in a political decision-making, saying, don't do that because we agreed not to do that. We agreed not to attack this country, blah, blah, blah. But it is part of a cost and benefit analysis. And it has always been. Now, we do prefer the law being obeyed. Why do we do that? We do that because we assume that international law is a stratified deposit of wisdom and experience, historic experience. We believe that if we keep those rules, we will be better off in the long term. In the short term, very frequently, breaching the law appears to be useful, practical, nationally approved, etc. The long-term outcomes are different, and they are reflected in international law.
Thank you very much. There can be 2 possible ways to go. One is, and I asked this question, and you don't have to answer, all of you. Maybe some of you will pick this line. What is current Hungary's contribution to the European values? Maybe it is a provocation which creates a new system of values in the European Union, or make the European Union more pragmatic. I mean, it is unprecedented that there is a member state which consciously works against the principles of the Union and openly challenges it. So what about pragmatic, normative, soft, hard power, coalitions, compromises in a situation where Ukraine needs the support and Hungary is blocking it? So So it is not just a theoretical question. So how it is perceived in Western Europe or in the EU. And you are right that Europe is not just the EU, so we should also think of West Balkans and other countries. So that's one thing, and that really connects us to the coming Hungarian elections when Europe is a topic. And Orbán already mentioned that maybe Hungary would do some drastic steps after the elections if Fidesz wins vis-à-vis the European Union. So that is one type of question, and feel free to pick this line. And the other one is the European values. Are those Euro-Atlantic values or you know, German, Franco-German values vis-à-vis the US? Think about Greenland and the debate between Denmark and the US. So sometimes it is used as the Christian civilization or the Judeo-Christian civilization or secularization or multiculturalism, because this Europe is not the Europe which existed 50 years ago. So there are migration waves, different religions, different cultures. So when we approach European values, is it exclusive or it is more inclusive now? Is it universal or it is still a fortress Europe? So I wish you to think a little bit, maybe as an impact of migration waves. On the right, there is a panic, moral panic here, that there is a death of Europe, the end of Europe as we know it. Is it a sad story, or it just brings some new opportunities for the future? So that's the other type of question. The floor is open, and okay, Boldi, please.
Because I thought that...
Which one, the second one, first one?
Both.
Don't forget Hungary, please.
No, I don't forget Hungary. I promise to you. But when we speak about the values of the EU, you can think of the Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union. That's respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, respect for human rights. These are listed there as the values of the European Union, and then they should be realized in a society which is based on pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and the equality of women and men. That's a relatively long list, and I think that nobody in Hungary, not even in the government, would challenge them at the value level. Okay, illiberal democracy, but otherwise, most of the time they would support that. What I want to introduce into the discussion is the other branch of, if you want, values. And my question is, do you consider these values? Do you consider values an area without internal frontiers? Do you consider value the mutual trust assumed to be valid among the EU member states? Security and justice in an area of the European Union? The internal market? The aspiration to have economic growth? That is all the other things which the EU has promised itself and to its member states and is realizing to a great extent. Now, does Hungary support all these values? Yes, it does. Absolutely. It's in favor of them. So what I see is that there's a government in Hungary which, for short-term political gains, offers a very specific interpretation of some of these values. Support for Ukraine. Now, support for Ukraine is not part of the values which the EU promised for itself. It is an ethical stance we would all approve, at least in the panel, I assume. So we all want to support Ukraine. Me certainly very much so, because I deal with refugee law. But it's not an obligation of the EU. There were many other armed conflicts in which the EU did not support the good part, who was fighting a just war against an opponent. So that does not derive from the EU constitution or the EU rules, I believe. Let's stop here.
Yeah, please. I think Gabor wants to, and then Kristof or Christina.
I partly agree with you, Boldi, not totally. It's for sure that the Hungarian government never claimed that they do not agree with rule of law. Their argument has always been that the rule of law cannot be properly defined. Proof, the Venice Commission has a list of ingredients is more than 100. So one can claim no one knows what really rule of law means. But if we ask the audience, they can say at least 3 or 4 most important elements of the rule of law, which are certainly violated by the Hungarian government from the very beginning. So the other thing, and then there are values they do not talk about. They do not talk about solidarity, which is one of the most important values and methods to act together.
When they want only to the border protection, immediately they talk about solidarity.
Yeah, but they do not talk about solidarity in the case of Ukraine. They do not talk about solidarity in any other foreign policy issues, because they are just not talking about that. So, in other words, yes, there is a formal compliance with in words. On the other hand, there is a practical violation every day, and most importantly, the EU knows that from the very beginning, from 2000, let's say 11 onwards. In the case of Hungary, they know that Hungary breaches the most important values of rule of law first, then democracy as well, protection of minorities, and so on. So, in other words, there is a kind of hypocrisy in the sense from the part of the EU. Blaming Hungary to violate all those rules, which they do clearly. On the other hand, they did not anything against those violations. They started Article 7 procedure in 2018. The question is still, the procedure hasn't been concluded yet. The question is whether there is a risk of the violation of the rule of law in Hungary. Come on, is there anyone asking this question really, really seriously, whether there is a risk? So, in other words, the values are there as a normative requirement. On the other hand, and this is law, we all know that due to Weimar, due to the World War II, the EU was willing to proceed in a legal way, and this is the reason that the values are entrenched in the treaties, in various parts, in various articles. But on the other hand, there was no political consensus to enforce those values. So up until 2018, the EPP kept Fidesz as one of its member states, with the clear knowledge that Hungary violates all the values. So it's not only the treaties and the values, this is also the politics of the EU. And let me say one minor thing to your first intervention, Boldi. I'm not an international law scholar, but I for my taste, your take on international law it's a bit relativized. So let's say not using force. Is it an international law principle or not? what you are saying, of course, the institutional setting of the Security Council is not fit to enforce this principle, because those who use the force are members of the Security Council, so they will veto any kind of violation of this principle. But is there a principle or not?
There is a rule.
I would say not a natural law, but a normative. Yeah.
Yeah, my job here is to offer equal time for the participants, so please.
Yeah, because I'm the only woman in this panel, so I think, European values as well mean for me equality as a woman. So that there, at least, it's written in the treaties and it's kind of promoted. Of course, there's always the limitations that they're not implemented in not only Hungary, but also in other countries. But this is kind of really important, equality, and actually for me as well. But I know when we had the constitutional discussion, they tried to get God into the contracts and have the Christian context in the constitution. But I really would prefer a secular EU. I think this is kind of important because we have other faiths in living in the EU as well. And I think we really have to be inclusive rather than exclusive. This even goes now to migration. But this is a different, if we, again, normative power, whatever we want to reflect outside to other countries, then I think this is important as well. I don't know, enlightenment is, of course, comes into play as well, which I connect with European values. So now about, not forgetting about Hungary. So what has Hungary done for the EU or not? I think what we should be doing because of Hungary is, first of all, really discussing what democracy means. So democracy is a very important, this is one value of the EU. But we have a government who does everything it can, illegally and legal ways, to not hand over power. One basic principle of democracy is that political parties get in competition with each other every 4 to 5 years, explain what their program is, and the people can select the government. And that includes that a government has to hand over power. That's democracy. That party knows that with the next elections they could regain power. But we have now a situation, and I, again, with my ideas of the Western Balkans, we have a Vučić doing the same. Vučić and Orban ignoring actually what the people want. Okay, you can say it's a polarized society, it's just half of the people who want something else than Orban. Orban's narrative is kind of what the government says, that's what the people want. But that's not true. There is the state, and there is a government, and there it's its people, and people are just plural, have a pluralism, have different ideas about what they want. But, and this is kind of, again, maybe an EU value to accept pluralism, to accept that the different voices in Europe, and trying to bring them together. It's, again, maybe, create the space for discussion, more provide space for people to come together. I don't know how we can do that, but this is kind of my idea. And I think what Hungary is problematic about is just giving us a role model of what not should be happening in the EU in other countries. But I know, for example, I'm Austrian, the Freedom Party in Austria, they say officially that their aim is to implement a system like Orban in Austria.
Kristof, just 1 second. Yes, indeed, Adam Przeworski famously said that democracy is a political system in which parties lose elections. So winning all the time is, after a while, boring and makes you suspicious that the system is not democratic. So that is a proposition that it should be made more pluralistic. Thanks.
We all know the problem is that they're operating in a gray zone in which it's very hard to. They haven't overtly stolen an election. There's still elections held in this country. People can vote. The vote is more or less secret. There are, you know, when it comes to the very poor people, there are leaks here and there. We know the methods that they're using. But still, it's not that they're coercing violently with physical means these people. It's more they're offering financial incentives for some people to vote for them, poor people. I live in the poorest part. I mean, before I left, poorest part of Hungary, they come around and say 10 euro the vote, come and vote. So in the big cities, that's how it works. In the countryside, it's a bit different. There's more sticks there than carrots. But you know, like, I'm just trying to enter into some small polemic that I think until now, the system or the ruling party was able to create, you know, consent in Gramscian terms. They enjoyed the support of a very broad section of the population. It is obviously true that they tilted the playing field heavily towards themselves, but that's the problem. It's still a gray zone that they're in, and it's very hard to say they are fully anti-democratic. Yes, they're tilting the playing field, but like, are we going to vote in 3 days and hope for a change? Yes, we all are, probably. So it's hard to argue for the fact that it's impossible in such a regime to change the government, and this is what makes it extremely slippery and difficult. About the previous question, what has Hungary done or not done? I mean, again, they're operating in gray zones. Here I'm not talking about the law, but when it comes to really the rights of sexual minorities in this country, I think they've come pretty close to a certain, what I would call a civilizational consensus in Europe, which of course is not full. It's, you know, there are people who question it. But I think the Poles were the only other government within the EU who came really close to, who violated the rights of sexual minorities. With their LGBT-free zones, in this country it was about banning the pride. And I think they would have gone further, except I can't remember anymore what happened in the political process, but there was some big happening, and so it took their attention away. But they clearly had the intention of going further against sexual minorities. And of course, the terrain I know a bit better is because I worked with Roma also in my pre-political life. I mean, there was a clear breach. There was an infringement procedure about the segregation of Roma children in schools. And there you could prove, basically, with the help of the statistics collected by the government itself and private churches, that the Roma children are systemically still segregated in this country in public schooling. Now again, it seems they're great at this. They found a zone in which they could paper over this problem by allowing churches to take whoever they want. And so the churches in rural Hungary have become basically the breeding grounds for local elites. In some cases, other churches, this is the Catholic, the Protestant, and mostly these two churches, and other churches have, in some parts of the country, taken over custodianship of the poorest children, Roma children. It's a legal way of doing segregation, but there's nevertheless a clear, it's written white and black that they have infringed on this particular right of the Roma minority. So I think in certain respects, when it comes to especially the minorities, they have come close to, yeah, go ahead.
That was a great news, actually, that the Pride was the biggest anti-systemic protest in the history of Hungary. So it was coming like a big surprise. Yeah. So I don't want to say as a happy ending, but
yes,
but it was a good news.
But in Pécs, in southern Hungary, where the Pride was also banned, it was less of a happy story. I think people were really genuinely intimidated there, and I'm not sure they'll continue. So in Budapest, yes, it continues.
And if I may ask, is it a very specifically Hungarian issue, or if your studies in East Germany, you don't find similar things, or other countries?
In East Germany, the far right doesn't go so clearly against. I mean, I would say trans people are also in the targets, our targets. of far-right propaganda, so yes. But interestingly, I have a PhD student who did field work amongst the AfDs. There's a very small group of gay men in the AfD who are trying to create space for themselves and calling themselves patriotic gay men. And
like Fidesz, but they don't say.
no, this is different. They were like the head of AfD, exactly. And so they were, after, there's big debate around this particular group, but they were, let's say, accepted as not fully equals within the party, but nevertheless can operate within the party. So let's just say, I think the battle lines are drawn a bit elsewhere. And if I look, I do research in Cottbus these days. The LGBT crowd there doesn't feel physically intimidated by them. The people who feel physically intimidated and insecure are the Syrian refugees.
Unless if I may say 2 words very briefly. I mean, where Hungary really inflicted the greatest harm to the EU and not to itself is the asylum issues. That it totally destroyed its own asylum system and denied cooperation on the asylum. That's where it inflicted harm on the EU, including the fact that in 2015 it waved 400,000 people through Hungary and let them go to Austria. Most of the other harms in terms of democracy is inflicted on itself. So we might look into that. Is there a difference when you inflict on yourself harm and when you directly inflict harm on the EU? Sure, the blocking of the support for Ukraine is a harm inflicted on the EU. And the last remark, I mean, you seem to ignore this second set of values, the internal market, prosperity, cohesion fund. I would see them as EU values. So the high-flying values of democracy and pluralism and all that, these are abstract ones, more or less, not fully, sure. But don't we want to look at the actual achievements of the EU as values? The Samoa Agreement with 78 African Caribbean states. Don't we want to see that in terms of the normative value as well as values?
That is yours. Okay, let me move to the next point, that wartime. So Europe is now described often as a weak continent. Europe is weak. But in what sense it is weak? So just because it is militarily not able to come to the level of the US and Russia, or maybe they can. And what would be good normatively? On the one hand, we are celebrating Finland and Sweden that they joined NATO and Europe became stronger. And the GDP per capita larger part of GDP will be spent on military preparations for a possible war. It looks like a necessary step to preserve security. On the other hand, there is another Europe which is sort of like the museum of the world, the culture of the world, Renaissance and Baroque and all these things. So is it something that Europe will lose if we just turn to the military side of the European identity, or isn't it something which is a wrong direction to go? Can we expect that the Atlantic umbrella will defend us for after Trump? So can we expect free riding on the military thing, which was classically the case after the Second World War? So what is this weakness? Are we weak, or strength is somewhere else?
I'm happy to start, not to discuss. No,
it looks like your night.
No, I don't want that. But I mean, if you look at the GDP of the EU is at the moment a society of 450 million people. And we produce, according to the IMF calculations, roughly $20 trillion per year. This is more than what China produces. China is in the range of 18 to 19. The US is in the range of 28 to 30. Russia is in the range of 1.7 to 2. So if you consider economic wealth as an expression of strengths, then we are certainly strong. Now, if you look at the Draghi report, of course, then you find out that we may be strong, but we might be on the wrong trajectory. But that's, again, it's manageable. What Draghi suggests in terms of innovation, less bureaucracy, etc., that is doable. In terms of the military capabilities, military nowadays is only partially based on hardware. It is to a large extent based on software or other types of kinetic and non-kinetic tools, like in the outer space, presence and control of the outer space, etc. So you can't count or record the military strengths of the EU simply by counting how many Tigers do we have, Tiger tanks, I mean. It's a much more complex issue, I believe. But I'm not an expert on that, so I hand it over to anyone who feels
it's
being
part
an
of the
expert on
public
tanks
discourse.
and rockets and all that.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, let me start by saying I'm not an expert. I'm really someone who reads the news. So the first condition to think about this issue and consider to change course, how we expect the current US course to long last, stay with us. Because if this will be the case, and despite the person, this lunatic person, there is a possibility that the course will be changed even after Trump or after senior Trump, and that means that the EU certainly should think anew what to do, how to use the NATO, maybe without the US, not relying on the US, because this was the assumption that the EU and the EU countries within the NATO are very much relying on the US. So if we assume that there will be no change, then we have to rethink this. I still tend to think that this is not a long-term change in the US. Not in the sense which has started with Trump 2.1. For me, as a layperson, the real innovation of Trump is that he is not poorly representing the US's national interest. He is representing business interest, partly his own personal business interest, and the economic world, at least the U.S. Environment of oligarchs seem to join him in that way of thinking, not about national or even transnational interest, but on business interest. But if this will be a short-term strategy for the EU, I don't think that there is much to cry in that respect. Okay, the EU has a lot of issues, internal issues to solve internally. So I'm convinced that the problem of Hungary and partly Poland until but coming up, the Slovakia and others, So it needs to be treated with a treaty change. For instance, considering to kick out certain member states.
Let's now go down from the elite level to the society, and I wonder whether Kristof can add something to this living in Germany, that how ordinary people and particularly young people react to these military conflicts and wars which occur in Ukraine or in the Middle East or elsewhere. How do they criticize, if they do, the European Union, and what sort of policy change they want?
I mean, there's a huge debate in Germany about. It's not the. It's a silent but protracted debate about how long the war could go on and how long they can support Ukraine. I mean, the support for Ukrainians is still relatively strong, but it has been eroded over the past 3 years. Clearly, it's not where it used to be. And you know, it is exactly the type of people who I mentioned amongst whom this erosion is the strongest. And it's not, we always say, we always talk about East Germany. To some extent it's true. The AfD is the strongest there. The nostalgia for, let's say, things Russian is clearly present amongst the people I talk. But it's no longer just, I just want to say we can't just treat it as an East German issue anymore. It's a countrywide debate. And the thing is that the Germans, the way they see it is they're going to have to invest in the military for decades. Their military has been so much defunded and is in such a state that there's a consensus around that. Perhaps the left party doesn't agree with this, but the rest certainly do, that they need to really ramp up spending. And the issue is that what I was trying to say in my introductory comments is that social cohesion is crumbling in Europe, and that is fostering the far right. So you're thinking of which thumb to bite, or you bite the thumb or the index, because you have to increase military spending, but there is no more money to spend. So how do you do that without decreasing social spending? And this is the trap that Germany is in the moment. They found a temporary reprieve, maybe for 4 years, which is the budget. The deficit brake has been lifted. So they can take on debt of about 500 billion, which is, looks like a lot of money. And it is, but it's a huge country. And the needs of the military are in the hundreds of billions. So there, for now, as far as I see the debate, they don't really see the light at the end of the tunnel. What they're trying to do is kind of spend a bit on everything. But the latest kind of piece of news was that the finance ministry has been caught with its pants off, using that special dedicated fund to develop infrastructure, the 500 billion, to plug the budget holes. So they're not spending it clearly the way that it was designed to and that is set in law. They're cheating on their own legal terms, if you will. That just shows the pressures that this government is navigating under. And if you ask me more about the societal response, it's vastly polarized. Among young people, there is, I would say, a real reticence towards the militarization of society. There's a fear of what that will mean. And there's a critique of what that could mean. So I think while there's an acceptance that Germany needs to get its military into some form, I think there's a real understanding, because of 45 and what happened and the destruction that the country underwent, that they should not go too far in militarizing society. And I think that's very difficult to do, because you have to put out billboards inviting young men into the army. But how do you stop them from building a culture of men becoming killing machines, as they did in the 20s, in the interwar period, which eventually led to fascism, right? It grew out of young men who came from war, who didn't find their place in society, didn't have jobs, and who became killing machines basically in the fraternities. I'm quoting Tevelites work. So I think there is a real fear of the same thing happening, of us going down the same path, of militarizing too far. And that's the debate that's ongoing. I see the same debate in Poland, by the way, where they are even more fearful, of course, of Russia. And they have gone, I think, a step further by setting up, by basically training everyday citizens to use guns. I think this is a real debate that all of us need to have. I'll end with this. I see it in this country when I keep coming back. I just took the tram and saw that there was a Panzer parked right in front of the. A bit everywhere now, but they keep appearing. It's election time, but so it's like this thing is happening. These are symbols that are being used, and I think to end here that this is something we need to really reflect on.
Thank you very much. The final word will be given to Christina, but before that, a brief comment, and then I will give the floor to the audience to ask questions and comments. So just a footnote to what you were saying, that in Hungary, the Islamic migration was blamed for the militarization. So Orbán tried to skillfully connect this wartime thing. It is because of the previous migration wave, and this is a clash of civilization, if you wish. Samuel Huntington is back in that sense. Maybe that Germany is not going that far, but in Hungary that was used by the propaganda. Christina, please.
Yeah, but the militarization of Hungary, I think even the last election time we had the tank in front of the airport, and there was a lot of police suddenly around. There were guys, they were 19, 18 with guns in the underground. So I was frightened that something happens there rather than from anything else. But I think this is kind of, again, they redo something they have already done the last elections to fear or frighten people, and then to tell everyone, but if you vote for Orbán, everything will be fine. Sorry. Secure, exactly. So everything else, any other selection creates chaos and is insecure. Yeah, and now I forgot about the actual question about. But I just would like to add something what you were saying, because the Austrian history is the same. We had the Second World War is something we really still have to work and look at the legacies. Which is a kind of very, very difficult task, but and I was kind of surprised, because Austria is neutral, and the Austrians were always laid back, saying, "Oh, we don't want to put money in our military because someone is going to help us anyway, because we're surrounded by NATO states." And then I was thinking, no, not so sure if that's really a good strategy. But now even, we have a lot of economic difficulties as well, similar to Germany, but still they started buying military machines and machinery, and they're discussing the extension of the military service. So there's a lot of going on, which I thought for a long time, this is never able to happen. And I don't know how the defense ministry is working her how is she going into the coalition gets the funding for these military means. So, and the Freedom Party, I think this is a different approach now. The Austrian Freedom Party is actually in favor of it. So we're not quite sure that they were discussing of having a referendum on if or for how long the military service is going to be extended. But the Freedom Party was always kind of for a strong military service. So now they cannot say they don't want to have that anymore. So it's maybe a different narrative. But about the change of the US, we don't know, but I actually think the US policy is going to change. So once even in NATO, the member states reach the 2% or even the 5% is now what's the aim. I think the US is trying to withdraw more and more from Europe. So I think and now we don't know what direction it's going. Is the EU now militarizing more or increasing their military capacity, or NATO, or what do the neutral states do? But I think we have to invest more, unfortunately, in defense, which is, of course, taking money out of other projects, which creates huge difficulties for societies. So there's less money available. I mean, we can think about big business which could be taxed, maybe even the businesses producing the military materials, but where to take the money, how to make sure that there is kind of as well social security within the societies. Otherwise, we have a polarization and then maybe further democratic backsliding because people are not believing in the democracies and the democratic institutions, and that's going to be, I think, the challenge for not only for the EU but for the EU member states and even other democratic countries in Europe. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And now the floor is open for any question and comment. Please. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for four. Okay. Thank you for four very interesting presentations. Time is limited, so let me just ask two questions or two comments. Boldizsar, you gave a very spirited and robust defense of international law, but is it not the case that although there have always been violations of international law, something has shifted since Trump has come on the scene, and particularly his second period in office? There is now this open, flagrant flouting of international law, disregard of international law, which amongst others, the US Secretary General, UN Secretary General has noted, but particularly that wonderful speech by the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney. So are you not underplaying the reality of the challenge to international law? Second question to Kristof. I hope I didn't misunderstand you, but you were talking about the rise of the far right within Europe, within the EU, and you ascribed it, if I understood you correctly, at least in part, to the failure of EU integration. But I'm conscious, because one of my passports is British, but I'm conscious that the EU, which is no longer, the United Kingdom, which is no longer, sadly, part of the EU, is witnessing the same trend with the rise, accelerated rise of the far right there, which certainly cannot be ascribed to any failure of EU integration. There must be other causes. Nigel Farage, the Reform Party, must draw its support, as do many far-right parties within the European Union, from other factors: economic insecurity, dislocation, a sense of a challenged national or local identity. What other factors would you put the onus on? Thank you.
Time is short, so I suggest to collect some more questions, and then it is already 2 questions, and maybe we can receive some more. Students can ask questions as well. Naturalmente. If not, then who are the addressed? Boldizsar first, and then Christina or Kristof? Kristof.
Istvan, thank you for your question. I mean, you know the answer better than I do because you are the famous international law professor. But the first part of the answer relates to Trump's personality. I consider him an ephemeral phenomenon, okay? He's coming and going. And whatever he says is almost insignificant because in all contexts he says things which are unimaginable, intolerable, contrary to any diplomatic tradition on the Northern Hemisphere in the last 100 years. I mean, announcing a doctrine of Monroe in his own name, appropriating the Western Hemisphere, come on. I mean, so I seriously resist treating his statements as statements of the United States of America meant to be valid for long term. I just ignore him. But whenever Iran happens to bombard the Saudi Arabia installations, civilian installations, then Trump is the first to say, oh, this is unfair, this is contrary to international law. So he's absolutely not consequent. He relies on international law when it's convenient for him. Therefore, if you take out his personality of the equation and you say, okay, what will the US do after Trump? What do other states do? What does Carney argue for? What does the Samoa Agreement, concluded by more than 100 states, call for? They all call for the use of international law. But even ironically, the Peace Board, so spiritfully established by Donald J. Trump and his associate, that says that they are there to promote international law. So in that sense, I'm more relaxed. It's very flagrant. But when I think of what the Soviet troops said before they moved in 1956 to Hungary, did they praise international law, the Warsaw Pact? Did they come forward with a Brezhnev doctrine entitling them to go into Czechoslovakia? Or what did the NATO say when it started to bombard Yugoslavia? Oh, this is necessary now. We have to protect the Kosovar Albanians. So we do have moments when international is pushed aside in a flagrant way, as you say. I agree with you. And it's very painful for both of us, of course. But it did happen. There is nothing extraordinary in that at the moment.
The question wasn't addressed to me. I have some partial comments to your.
Everybody has the same right to respond.
Your point, István. And I take your question more broadly than the phenomena of or the result of the increase of the right wing. It's not only that; it's the decrease of liberal democracy altogether. And here I have a semi optimistic view. A little bit taken over by my favorite political scientist, David Runciman, recently in a podcast, saying that the decline of liberal democracy and the increase of the far right is partly due to the fact also that people are very much disappointed with the way of representative government in the Western world, in the global North. I can mention, let's say, Italy. So the consequent failures of the traditional party's governance led to the governance of Meloni. Neo-fascist ideologue who seemed to be successful up until today's referendum, maybe, but we don't know. But this is also a good news from the perspective that those people are disappointed with the way of liberal democratic governance. And they want something better. They want something more effective. They want something more inclusive. And this is for me, the bright side of populism. Not necessarily right-wing, but as I said, the problem is wider than the increase of the right wing.
So just to give a counterpoint, I'm not so optimistic about the US's trajectory. I hope you two are right, but my sense is that this is a declining hegemonic power. It's a very slow decline, but it's a decline. It's no longer capable of having these protruded presence in all parts of the world, and I do see a strategy behind leaving Europe and focusing on what matters to them most, which is securing their backyard in South America and opposing China's advance in East Asia. I think those are their priorities, and that is where they'll concentrate no matter what government and president will come after this. You're probably right that Trump is a disruptor, and someone who follows him, who could be the current vice president, or someone like him, will be a bit more strategic and capable of carrying a line, which Trump is clearly unable to at this point. But I don't think that that will create a fundamentally new trajectory for the US. I think they'll have to manage this declining hegemonic position they have, for better or worse. We'll see. I'm just saying that I think there are more pessimistic voices around, and I had to throw mine in. And yeah, it matters because it matters how we position ourselves as Europeans, of course, and what we focus on. So it's not a theoretical debate. To your question, I wasn't specifically alluding to the failure of European integration. I was alluding to the rupture in the social contract. That is what I perceive it, what I called the solidarity deficit, which translates into diverse political forms. One can be a critique of the current system of representation. But as an anthropologist, I tend to think, no, it tends to be more, go in the direction of anti-establishment feelings, which fed into Brexit. So I think the social dislocations feeding into a sense of abandonment in relation to ruling elites is also what fed Brexit, or what was the main explanatory force for me for Brexit, and around the Trump phenomenon too. So I would separate that from the European integration process, which I think also caused certain dislocations. If you look at Fidesz's victory in 2010, at least my research showed that in the Hungarian countryside, people who, for instance, were dependent on agriculture found that the process was, to say the least, mismanaged by the social liberal government. They felt that the government hadn't prepared them as agricultural producers for the onslaught that was coming when the markets were opened. These people that I worked with were wine producers, and they lost their markets in Hungary because people started buying cheaper and better Spanish and Italian wines in Hungary. And they felt that the social liberal government hadn't prepared them. In fact, they kept continuously quoting a certain minister whose name we had forgotten, who said, I'm not quoting him correctly, but a few tens of thousands of jobs will be lost, but the country will gain. That was his answer to the enraged peasants. And peasants matter in politics, as we see all over Europe. So all I'm trying to say is I think it did play a role, but I wasn't talking specifically of that because that was a previous historic period, which fed into the first illiberal wave. But I think if we want to understand the Western European, what is happening in the core of Europe, I see it as primarily having to do with this integration of working class communities and their anger, and the way that is currently channeled in a much more successful way by the far right than the radical left or the Social Democrats. By the way, last word, yesterday's election in Rheinland-Pfalz, I don't know if any of you saw it. The SPD lost after 35 years. So it's a historic defeat for the Social Democrats, is what I'm trying to say. The CDU won, but the AfD gained more than double the votes it had. It gained 20% in a Western region, and 30% of workers went with the AfD. So there's something happening deeply in our societies that is very worrying, I think, and that I don't see answers to.
Christina, you want to add or no?
No, no, I just hand over.
No, actually, time is up. We have to finish now because it's more than 7:30. Thank you for coming. Thank you for following us and asking questions. And to my colleagues, a big thanks.
Thank you.
Akkor ezt ide visszarakom.